Prince Harry has such a cheek that he is now piling the pressure on Catherine, the Princess of Wales, to step in and try and save his failing relationship with Prince William. Not understanding that it's over, brother. It is gone.
Prince Harry has thrown William and Catherine under the bus over and over again. In his memoir, in films, in interviews, he has condemned the royal family. A compelling new report reveals that he regrets leaving the royal family and has been secretly hoping that William would have had more of a struggle and need him. He's been waiting for his brother to call.
Here is what nobody in Montecito wanted you to see. Not the carefully managed Instagram posts. Not the Netflix confessionals. Not the podcast apology tours dressed up as healing journeys. What you are about to watch is the moment a dynasty drew its final line. Prince William, a man who has spent years being painted as the cold one, the rigid one, the brother who couldn't forgive, did not explode. He did not issue a statement. He did not call a press conference. He did something far more devastating. He went completely, utterly, permanently silent. And when Harry's team reached out to Catherine, not William, Catherine, hoping she would be the softer entry point, hoping she would pick up where diplomacy had failed, hoping the Princess of Wales would do what she has always done and hold this family together with quiet grace. She didn't take the call. Let that settle for a moment. Catherine didn't take the call.
Catherine tried so hard for so long. You threw her efforts back in her face with your continued attacks, not just on William and Camilla, but on Catherine herself.
The woman who survived cancer with dignity that made the world weep. The woman who has never, not once, weaponized her pain in public. The woman Harry's own allies have spent months dragging through gossip columns and anonymous briefings. She saw the number, and she chose her peace over his crisis. This video is about what led to that moment. Because this wasn't a snap decision. This was the conclusion of a very long story, and if you watch until the end, you will understand not just what happened, but why it can never be undone. To understand why Catherine refusing that call is so significant, you have to understand what came before it. Not in broad strokes. Not the Meghan versus Catherine tabloid soap opera you've been sold for 6 years. The specific, documented moments where the line between public disagreement and personal insult was crossed and crossed again. Let's go back to the Oprah interview. March 2021. Harry and Meghan sat across from Oprah Winfrey and delivered what was, by any measure, a precision strike against the institution. But buried inside the headline-grabbing allegations was something that received far less analysis than it deserved at the time. The claim that Catherine, then Duchess of Cambridge, had made Meghan cry during a bridesmaid dress fitting in 2018, that she had been the aggressor. That Meghan had, in fact, been the one in tears but had simply been too gracious to correct the record when the story flipped. Here's what was documented. Here's what actually happened. Multiple sources, later confirmed by people inside the household, reported the opposite sequence of events. It was Meghan who had reduced Catherine to tears during that fitting, over flower girl dresses, over the cut, over details that seem minor until you understand that Catherine was 3 months postpartum and under enormous pressure. Catherine, to her immense credit, sent flowers the next morning. She tried to repair it privately. She said nothing publicly. Then it became a centerpiece of a global television interview. Now, people fight. Families disagree. That alone would not have permanently poisoned anything. But here's what mattered. Harry knew. Harry was there. Harry watched Catherine send those flowers. Harry watched his sister-in-law take the public heat for something she hadn't done, and he said nothing to correct it. That is the insult Catherine has never forgotten. Not because she's vindictive. Because she's precise. She knows the difference between someone who doesn't know the truth and someone who does, and stays quiet anyway. And it didn't stop there. The Netflix documentary. December 2022. Harry and Meghan, 6 episodes, an estimated $100 million budget, and inside it, more shading of Catherine's image. The body language expert segments. The implication that the warmth shown publicly was performance. The framing of Catherine as part of the machine that crushed them. Catherine watched it. Sources close to her described her as quietly devastated, not for herself, but for her children, who would one day be old enough to search their aunt and uncle's documentary and find their mother discussed as an antagonist. She still said nothing publicly. Then came the book. Spare. January 2023. And here, Harry crossed from narrative spin into something more personal. Details about Catherine's appearance on a specific day. Private conversations rendered in dialogue he could not have reconstructed with perfect accuracy. A portrait of a sister-in-law drawn with just enough warmth to seem fair and just enough edge to sting. What finally broke the silence on William's side, if not Catherine's, wasn't any single quote in the book. It was a pattern. 3 years of pattern. 3 years of Catherine being used as a supporting character in a story designed to justify departure, and never once being given the right of reply. William watched his wife's reputation be shaped by people she no longer speaks to. And he began methodically to close every remaining door. But even then, even after Spare, there were people inside the royal household who believed reconciliation was possible. There was one back channel left. One person who might still broker peace. And what happened to that back channel is the part of the story that has never been properly told. Royal reconciliation, when it happens, never happens through front doors. It happens through intermediaries. Through the quiet word at a country house weekend. Through a mutual friend who passes a message and waits. Through a godparent, a former equerry, a shared connection who can say, "I think there's room here," without anyone having to formally extend an olive branch that might be publicly refused. After the Jubilee in June 2022, where Harry and Meghan attended but were visibly separated from the working royals on the balcony, there was a brief, genuine window. Sources who spoke to journalists on background described quiet conversations about whether a structured private meeting might be possible. Not a press conference reconciliation. Not a Kensington Palace photo opportunity. Just a private conversation between brothers, somewhere without cameras. William, at that point, had not fully closed the door. He was angry. He was protective of Catherine in a way that had become something close to territorial. But he still believed, or allowed himself to believe, that Harry, underneath the Montecito machinery, was still his brother. The condition that came back, through intermediaries, was illuminating. Harry would not meet without Meghan present. And the meeting could not include any discussion of the content of the Netflix deal, the book deal, or any future media projects. William reportedly read that condition and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "He wants to come back to the family but bring the entire operation with him." That sentence tells you everything about how William was thinking. He wasn't drawing a line between Harry the brother and Harry the brand. He was watching them become the same thing, and he understood that you cannot make peace with someone who has turned the peace itself into content. Now here is where Catherine becomes central, not peripheral. At some point in late 2023, as Catherine was quietly managing what would later be revealed as a serious cancer diagnosis, a message was passed through a third party to people close to the Sussexes. The substance of it, as later reported, was essentially an ask. Would Catherine be willing to speak with Meghan directly, privately, to see if there was any foundation for rebuilding? The framing of this request, and this matters, positioned Catherine as the one who needed to extend grace. As if she were the obstacle. As if her composure in the face of years of public mischaracterization had been coldness rather than restraint. Catherine, who was at this point in the middle of chemotherapy, who was protecting her children from knowing the full gravity of her diagnosis, who was fighting for her life while maintaining a silence that protected the monarchy from further crisis, was being asked to do the emotional labor of fixing someone else's relationship. She declined. Not through a statement. Not through a spokesperson. She simply didn't engage. And that non-engagement was then characterized, in certain corners of the Sussex-adjacent media ecosystem, as proof of her intransigence. Her coldness. Her cruelty, even. When William found out how that request had been framed, that his wife, during cancer treatment, had been positioned as the problem, the back channel didn't just close. It was sealed. But there is a layer underneath even this. Because the request to Catherine didn't come from nowhere. It came after something happened in America, something that exposed, more clearly than anything before it, exactly what the Sussex operations priorities actually were. There is a particular kind of strategic error that intelligent people make when they have spent too long inside their own narrative. They start to believe the narrative is the reality. The Sussex brand, by 2023, had been built on a very specific architecture. Victimhood as virtue. Departure as courage. Silence from the palace as proof of guilt. And crucially, the idea that public sympathy, once earned, could be converted into leverage. This worked for a time. The Oprah interview moved global sentiment. The documentary had enormous viewing numbers. Spare debuted at #1. But there was a problem the analytics couldn't capture. Sympathy and respect are not the same thing. You can feel sorry for someone and still not want them back at the table. The miscalculation, the one that I would argue permanently ended any realistic path to reconciliation, was the decision to continue monetizing royal adjacency while simultaneously demanding royal rehabilitation. In plain terms, you cannot keep selling access to the family drama while also asking the family to welcome you home. The market logic and the emotional logic are irreconcilable. William understood this. He'd understood it earlier than most people realized, and here's the evidence. After Spare was published in January 2023, there was no public response from William. None. Royal commentators initially read this as weakness, as William being outmaneuvered, unable to respond to a brother who just put the most intimate details of their relationship into a best-selling memoir. That reading was wrong. William's silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Specifically, it was the strategy of someone who has decided the other party is no longer operating in good faith in that engagement. Any engagement only feeds the machine. By mid-2023, sources inside the royal household described William's position as beyond firm. Not angry, beyond anger. Anger implies you still care enough to be disturbed. What was described was something colder, a complete recalibration of expectations. He stopped waiting for Harry to choose differently. He started building his future, his reign, his family, his image, entirely around that reality. And Catherine, as she recovered through the back half of 2024, was doing the same thing. When she returned to public life, that walkabout at Windsor, then trooping the color, the world saw something that no Sussex-adjacent briefing could spin, a woman who had been through something genuinely terrible and come back not diminished but clarified. There is something that happens to people who face mortality and come out the other side. They become very, very clear about where their energy goes. Catherine came back clear. The attempt to route around William and reach Catherine directly, to treat her as a separate, softer target, was not just a tactical error. It was a misread of who she is. Catherine has never been the gentle counterweight to William's steel. She is the steel. She's simply never needed to show it the way he does. And there is one more chapter to the story. Because even after all of this, the Oprah allegations, the documentary, the book, the cancer-era request, there were people who believed Harry still had one option. One final card. And the story of why he couldn't, or wouldn't, play it is the most revealing part of all. What would genuine reconciliation have required? Let's be specific, because the conversation around this is almost always kept deliberately vague, and vagueness serves the people who benefit from the conflict continuing. Genuine reconciliation would have required 3 things. They are not complicated. They are not unreasonable. They are simply the things that no peace is possible without. First, a private, unambiguous acknowledgement to Catherine that the Oprah interview's characterization of her was wrong. Not a PR statement. Not a carefully worded joint communique. A private, direct acknowledgement from Harry and Meghan that Catherine did not make Meghan cry at that fitting, that the public record was allowed to stand incorrectly, and that this caused real harm. Second, a genuine pause on all commercial exploitation of royal relationships, not necessarily permanent, but a demonstrable period where the Sussex operation stopped treating the family as content source material. This would have needed to be long enough to be credible, not a 2-week pause before the next podcast season. Third, acceptance that any return to royal life, even informal, even partial, comes on the institution's terms, not negotiated through media pressure. Harry could not deliver any of these 3 things. Not, I would argue, because he didn't want peace, but because the infrastructure around him, the deals, the brand partnerships, the media ecosystem that has been constructed, cannot survive those conditions. The Oprah acknowledgement would retroactively undermine the documentary, The content pause would breach commercial obligations. And accepting the palace's terms would mean surrendering the narrative control that the entire Montecito operation is built on. This is not a story about a bad person. This is a story about a man who made a series of decisions that cannot now be unmade, and built a life around those decisions that cannot accommodate the thing he says he still wants. William sees this. William has done the math. And William's conclusion, the conclusion that explains every closed door, every unanswered call, every silence, is this: his brother is not coming back. Not because William won't let him, but because the version of Harry who could come back no longer exists. The most devastating thing about this story is not the conflict. It's what the conflict reveals. Two brothers who genuinely loved each other, there is no serious dispute about that, became separated not by malice but by choices. And choices, unlike feelings, have consequences that compound. Every door that closed was closed by a decision made somewhere by someone. And somewhere along the line, the decision stopped being reversible. Let's be precise about what erasing Harry actually looks like, because it doesn't look like the movies. It doesn't look like a shouted confrontation. It doesn't look like a legal document or a formal decree. It looks like this. William stopped including Harry in his mental model of the future. That sounds subtle. It is not subtle. For someone in William's position, a future king, a man whose decisions about institution and family will shape the monarchy for decades, to remove someone from the architecture of how he thinks about what comes next is total and complete. Harry is no longer factored in. Not to succession planning conversations. Not to the question of how royal charitable work evolves. Not to what the coronation looked like or what future major events will look like. Not to anything. When the king, their father, has needed both sons in the same room, William has attended and been professional. He has not caused scenes. He has not made it about himself. But the warmth is gone, and people who have been in those rooms describe a quality of absence in William's engagement with Harry that is more final than any argument could be. This is a man who has made peace with a loss. And Catherine? Catherine's non-engagement with that final call is the clearest possible signal of where she stands, not out of hatred, not out of spite, but out of something that is in some ways more final than either of those. She has healed. She has moved through the hardest year of her life and come out the other side with a clarity about what matters and what doesn't. And the drama, the proxy wars, the late-night calls routed through intermediaries asking her to do the emotional labor of rescuing a situation she didn't create. It simply doesn't make the list anymore. There is something almost admirable about it, in the way that very clear boundaries can be admirable, even when they hurt someone. She is the Princess of Wales. She is a mother of 3 children who will grow up in public. She is a woman who has faced her own mortality with a composure that moved an entire world. She does not have the bandwidth, and more importantly, she does not have the inclination to manage Harry's crisis. This leaves Harry in a genuinely painful position, not one that many people will publicly sympathize with, because the sympathy account has been significantly drawn down, but painful nonetheless. He is in a foreign country, building a life that depends on royal adjacency for its commercial value, while the royals themselves quietly remove him from their peripheral vision. The longer the separation continues, the more the Sussex brand has to work with increasingly stale material, memories of palace life, old grievances, the same cast of characters who are now getting on with their own stories without him. The Netflix deal runs out. The Spotify deal already ended. The memoir sales curve, like all memoir sales curves, has moved from peak to plateau. What remains is the question of what Harry builds from rather than against, and that question he has not yet answered convincingly. Meanwhile, Catherine's trajectory is moving in the opposite direction. Her return to public life after cancer was one of the most genuinely moving stories in recent royal history, not because it was managed, but because it was real. People could see that she was thinner, that she was careful, that she was choosing every public appearance with intention rather than obligation. She appeared at Wimbledon and the crowd rose for her. She appeared at Trooping the Colour and her children flanked her, and there was a quality to that image, mother, children, future, that no documentary can manufacture. She is the heir's wife. She will be queen. And she has spent the past 3 years demonstrating, not through statements but through behavior, exactly the kind of person she is. The contrast with how she has been portrayed is so stark that it has become its own form of answer. Here is what this story is really about. It's not about a celebrity couple in California and a royal family in London. It's about a question that every family eventually faces in some form. What do you do when the cost of keeping someone in your life exceeds what you can sustain? Most families face this without cameras, without Netflix deals and memoir clauses and global audiences choosing sides. Most families navigate it in kitchen conversations and unreturned texts and Christmas dinners where someone is notably absent. The mechanics are different for the Waleses. The stakes are different. The visibility is stratospheric. But the emotional logic is identical. William and Catherine have done what people in genuinely healthy relationships eventually do when a relationship outside the marriage becomes damaging to the marriage. They stopped absorbing it. They stopped making it their problem to solve. And they focused, with apparently total commitment, on their own family, their own work, their own future. That is not cruelty. That is not erasure in the dramatic, cinematic sense. That is two people deciding that the version of reality being offered to them is not the reality they're going to live in. So where does this end? Not with a dramatic confrontation. Not with a palace announcement. Not with a statement from Kensington. It ends the way most things end, not with a bang but with the slow accumulation of time and distance until the gap is simply too wide to see across. Harry will continue building his life in California. He will find new causes, new projects, new ways to be relevant that don't require the family's participation. He is not without talent or genuine purpose. The Invictus Games is a real and valuable thing, and the work he has done on veterans' mental health has mattered. But the chapter of his life in which his relationship with William and Catherine was a live, active, potentially reparable thing, that chapter has closed. Not because William is heartless. Not because Catherine is unforgiving. But because there is a finite number of times you can wound someone before the wound becomes the relationship, and they are past that number. William is going to be king. He is going to stand in Westminster Abbey, as his mother stood before him, and take on something that very few human beings have ever been asked to carry. And he is going to do it with Catherine beside him, and his children watching, and the full weight of a history that stretches back centuries pressing down on that moment. Harry will not be central to that moment. He may be present. He may not be. But he will not be central. And here is the philosophical truth that cuts through all the noise, the briefings, the competing narratives, the books and the documentaries and the podcasts. You cannot leave a place and remain of it. You cannot sell a relationship and still have it. You cannot weaponize someone's grace and then expect it to keep being offered. These are not royal rules. These are human ones. Catherine knew them. She demonstrated them, quietly, every time she absorbed a public wound and sent flowers anyway, until the day she decided the flowers weren't going to help anymore. That day has passed. Some bridges aren't burned in anger. They're dismantled quietly, piece by piece, by the person who stopped believing the other side was worth reaching. Here is what I want to know from you. Do you think there is anything Harry could do at this point? Any action, any statement, any gesture that would genuinely change where this stands with William and Catherine? Not what you want to happen. Not what would be fair or unfair. What you actually believe is possible. Because that question, whether repair is possible or whether we are simply watching the formal documentation of something that ended years ago, is the one that determines everything about how this story gets told from here. Leave it in the comments. And if you want to understand the other side of this, the story of what William is actually building right now, the vision he has for the monarchy that is unlike anything his father or grandmother attempted, that video is already waiting for you. The transformation happening inside Kensington Palace is the story nobody is covering properly. Until then, watch carefully. The quiet ones always show you exactly who they are. You just have to be paying attention.